Sarah Chen thought the most dangerous thing about her job was getting a translation wrong. She was just another face among dozens of civilian contractors at Forward Operating Base Phoenix in Afghanistan's Helmand province. Her days were filled with interpreting radio chatter, translating documents, and helping bridge the communication gap between American forces and local Afghan allies. It was important work, but safe work, or so she believed. The morning of September 15, 2018, started like any other. Sarah sipped her instant coffee while reviewing intelligence reports in the climate-controlled comfort of the communications bunker. Outside, the desert sun was already climbing toward another scorching day. She had no way of knowing that in exactly 4 hours and 23 minutes, she would be crouched behind a burning Humvee, clutching an M4 rifle she'd only fired on a range, with Taliban fighters closing in from 3 directions. The attack that would thrust her into the line of fire didn't begin with explosions or gunfire.
It began with a mistranslation that would cost lives, shatter her quiet world, and transform a mild-mannered linguist into something she never thought she could become. This is the story of how one woman's split-second decision to leave her safe bunker would save an entire convoy and change the course of a critical mission that could shift the balance of power in one of Afghanistan's most contested regions.
Some heroes wear uniforms, some carry guns, and some carry dictionaries and find themselves holding both when the moment demands it. Sarah Chen had never imagined her linguistics degree from UC Berkeley would lead her to a dusty military base in one of the world's most dangerous regions. Yet here she was, 3 months into her contract with Global Language Solutions, working as a civilian translator at Forward Operating Base Phoenix in Afghanistan's volatile Helmand province.
The irony wasn't lost on her that someone who had spent years studying the beauty of language was now using those skills in a place where words could mean the difference between life and death.
The base itself was a small city of prefabricated buildings, concrete barriers, and razor wire, home to roughly 800 American and coalition forces.
It sat strategically positioned along Highway 1, the main artery connecting Kabul to Kandahar, making it a crucial logistics hub for operations throughout southern Afghanistan. For Sarah, it had become a strange kind of home, complete with its own rhythms, personalities, and unspoken rules of survival.
Her daily routine began each morning at 05:30 with the call to prayer echoing from nearby villages, a haunting reminder of the complex cultural landscape she navigated every day. After a quick breakfast of reconstituted eggs and coffee that could strip paint, she would make her way to the communications bunker, a reinforced concrete structure that served as the nerve center for intelligence gathering and analysis. This windowless room, filled with banks of computers, radio equipment, and satellite feeds, had become her sanctuary over the past 3 months. Sarah's colleagues were an eclectic mix of military personnel and civilian contractors. There was Master Sergeant Rodriguez, a veteran of 3 deployments who ran the intelligence section with military precision but treated Sarah with paternal protectiveness. Lieutenant Barnes, fresh out of West Point, approached every task with earnest enthusiasm that reminded Sarah of her undergraduate students, back when she briefly taught at Berkeley. And then there was Marcus Webb, another civilian contractor who specialized in signals intelligence and had a habit of working through lunch while muttering at his computer screens in what Sarah had come to recognize as a mixture of frustration and fascination. The work itself was more varied than Sarah had expected when she first accepted the position. Her primary responsibility was translating intercepted communications. Everything from Taliban radio chatter to formal documents recovered during raids. But she also served as an interpreter during meetings with local Afghan officials, helped decipher cultural nuances that could make or break negotiations, and occasionally found herself translating everything from love letters found on captured fighters to grocery lists that might contain coded messages. What struck Sarah most about the work was how intimate it could be. When you spend your days translating someone's private conversations, their fears, their hopes, their plans, you begin to understand them in ways that transcend politics and conflict. She had listened to Taliban fighters worry about their families, express doubt about their cause, and reveal surprisingly mundane concerns about money and relationships. It was a perspective that few people in the military had access to, and it had gradually changed how Sarah viewed the conflict around her. The technical aspects of her job required constant learning and adaptation. Dari and Pashto, Afghanistan's 2 main languages, were challenging enough on their own, but Sarah also had to master regional dialects, military terminology, and the constantly evolving slang used by various factions. She had filled 3 notebooks with terms that didn't exist in any standard dictionary, words born from war and necessity that captured concepts her Berkeley professors had never imagined. Beyond the linguistic challenges, Sarah had to develop an entirely new set of skills for life on a military base. She learned to recognize the difference between incoming and outgoing artillery fire by sound alone.
She memorized the locations of every bunker between her quarters and the communications center.
She discovered that baby wipes were more valuable than gold for staying clean in the desert, and that the key to surviving months of MREs was trading with other personnel to create some variety in the monotonous menu. The relationships she built at the base surprised her with their depth and complexity. Despite being a civilian in a military environment, she found herself accepted into a community bound together by shared risk and mutual dependence. Master Sergeant Rodriguez had taken to calling her Professor, a nickname that stuck despite her repeated explanations that she had never actually completed her PhD.
Lieutenant Barnes sought her advice on everything from cultural sensitivity to relationship problems with his girlfriend back home. Even the gruff Colonel Morrison, who commanded the base, had begun stopping by her workstation to check on her welfare and occasionally seek her input on operations.
Her living quarters were Spartan but functional, a small prefabricated room she shared with Dr. Lisa Park, a medic from Seoul who had become her closest friend on the base. They had bonded over their shared experience of being Asian American women, in a predominantly white male environment, though their backgrounds couldn't have been more different. Lisa was practical, direct, and unflappable under pressure, qualities that complemented Sarah's more analytical and cautious nature.
Their evening conversations, conducted in a mixture of English, Korean, and the military slang they had both unconsciously adopted, provided a crucial outlet for processing the stress and isolation of their situation. The base's security protocols had become second nature to Sarah after 3 months. She knew that the bunker sirens meant incoming rockets or mortars, and that she had exactly 90 seconds to reach the nearest hardened shelter.
She had memorized the radio frequencies for emergency communications and the codes used to indicate different threat levels. Her body armor and helmet, initially uncomfortable and awkward, now felt like a natural extension of herself.
She even carried a sidearm, a Beretta M9 that she had qualified with during her pre-deployment training but hoped never to use. What Sarah hadn't fully grasped during her preparation was the psychological toll of constant vigilance.
Every convoy that left the base might not return. Every intelligence report she translated might prevent an attack or might miss crucial details that could cost lives.
The weight of responsibility was unlike anything she had experienced in academia, where mistakes meant lower grades rather than casualties. She had developed her own coping mechanisms, including a detailed journal where she recorded not just events but her emotional responses to them, a practice that helped her maintain perspective amid the chaos.
The morning of September 15th began typically enough. Sarah arrived at the communications bunker before dawn to review overnight intelligence reports.
There had been increased radio chatter in the area over the past week, indicating possible Taliban movement, but nothing that seemed immediately threatening. The day's primary mission was a routine convoy to the district center in nearby Marja, where American forces were scheduled to meet with local officials about a reconstruction project.
It was the kind of mission that happened several times a week, important for maintaining relationships with Afghan partners, but generally considered low risk. As Sarah settled into her workstation with her morning coffee, she noticed an unusual pattern in the overnight intercepts. Several Taliban units had been using unfamiliar terminology, words that didn't quite fit the standard patterns she had learned to recognize. It was subtle, the kind of linguistic shift that only someone with extensive experience in the language would notice. She made a mental note to discuss it with Master Sergeant Rodriguez when he arrived, though at the time it seemed like a minor curiosity rather than a potential threat.
The first few hours of September 15th passed peacefully in the communications bunker. Sarah worked through her backlog of translations, helped Lieutenant Barnes prepare briefing materials for the afternoon's mission, and participated in the daily intelligence briefing.
The convoy to Marja was scheduled to depart at 1400 hours, and everything appeared to be proceeding normally. Sarah had no way of knowing that the unusual terminology she had noticed in the overnight intercepts was actually a new code system the Taliban had developed specifically for the ambush they were planning.
She couldn't know that her decision to mention this linguistic anomaly to Master Sergeant Rodriguez would set in motion a chain of events that would thrust her directly into the line of fire and change the course of her life forever. Master Sergeant Rodriguez arrived at the communications bunker at 0700 hours sharp, carrying his usual breakfast of black coffee and a protein bar that he claimed tasted like cardboard but provided the energy he needed to function. Sarah had been waiting for him, the unusual intercepts from the previous night still nagging at her consciousness like an itch she couldn't quite scratch. She had learned to trust her instincts when it came to language patterns, and something about the Taliban communications felt deliberately obscured in ways she hadn't encountered before.
"Morning, Professor," Rodriguez said, settling into his workstation with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this routine hundreds of times.
"What have we got today?" Sarah pulled up the relevant files on her screen, highlighting the sections that had caught her attention. There's something odd about these intercepts from last night.
The Taliban units in our area are using terminology I haven't seen before. It's not just new slang or regional dialect variations.
It's like they've developed a completely different vocabulary for certain concepts. Rodriguez leaned over her shoulder, studying the Dari and Pashto transcripts she had prepared.
His understanding of the local languages was limited, but he had developed a keen eye for recognizing patterns in intelligence reports. "Walk me through it," he said, pulling up a chair beside her workstation. Sarah pointed to specific phrases in the intercepts, explaining how certain common terms had been replaced with words that were technically correct but felt somehow artificial. Look at this conversation between two Taliban commanders.
Instead of using the normal word for convoy, they're using a term that literally means moving treasure. And here, where they would usually say attack, they're using a word that means harvest.
It's subtle but consistent across multiple intercepts. The more Sarah analyzed the pattern, the more convinced she became that it represented something significant. In her academic work, she had studied how languages evolved under pressure, how communities developed coded communication systems to protect sensitive information. What she was seeing in these intercepts displayed the hallmarks of a deliberately constructed alternate vocabulary, the kind of linguistic innovation that typically emerged when a group needed to communicate while avoiding detection.
Rodriguez was beginning to share her concern. As someone who had spent years analyzing enemy communications, he understood that sudden changes in communication patterns often indicated operational preparation.
How widespread is this new terminology, he asked, pulling up additional intercepts from the past week. Together, they spent the next 2 hours reviewing every Taliban communication that had been intercepted in their area of operations over the previous 7 days. The pattern was clear once they knew what to look for. Multiple Taliban units had simultaneously begun using this altered vocabulary, suggesting coordinated instruction from higher levels of command.
Even more troubling, the frequency of communications using the new terminology had been steadily increasing, culminating in a flurry of coded messages the previous evening. This isn't random, Sarah concluded, her academic training in computational linguistics providing a framework for understanding the data.
Someone has systematically developed an alternate vocabulary and distributed it to multiple units. The timing suggests they're preparing for something specific and they're trying to prevent us from understanding their coordination.
Lieutenant Barnes arrived for the morning briefing just as Sarah and Rodriguez were reaching their conclusions. Fresh-faced and eager as always, he immediately sensed the tension in the room.
"What's got you two looking like you've seen a ghost?" he asked, setting down his coffee and notebook. Rodriguez briefed Barnes on their findings, emphasizing the potential implications for the day's planned convoy mission to Marja. The route they were scheduled to take passed through several areas where Taliban activity had been detected, and if enemy forces were indeed coordinating an operation using coded communications, the convoy could be walking into a carefully prepared trap. Barnes listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions about the linguistic analysis that revealed his West Point education in intelligence operations. When Rodriguez finished his briefing, Barnes immediately reached for the secure phone to contact Colonel Morrison. "Sir, we may have a problem with today's Marja mission," he said when the colonel answered.
Colonel Morrison arrived at the communications bunker within minutes, still wearing his physical training uniform from his morning run. At 52, he was a career infantry officer who had commanded troops in Iraq and Afghanistan for over a decade, and he had developed an instinctive feel for when something wasn't right.
Sarah had only interacted with him briefly during her time on the base, but she knew he was respected by his soldiers for his combination of tactical competence and genuine concern for their welfare. "Show me what you've got," Morrison said without preamble, pulling up a chair to Sarah's workstation.
Sarah walked the colonel through her analysis, explaining the linguistic patterns she had identified and their potential significance. Morrison listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification on technical points but clearly understanding the implications of what she was describing.
His years of experience had taught him that the most dangerous threats were often the ones that seemed subtle and innocuous until it was too late to respond effectively. "How confident are you in this assessment?" Morrison asked when Sarah finished her presentation.
90%, Sarah replied without hesitation. The pattern is too consistent and too widespread to be coincidental.
Someone has put significant effort into developing and distributing this coded vocabulary. Given the timing and the increase in communication frequency, I believe they're coordinating for an imminent operation. Morrison turned to Rodriguez. "What's your read on this, Sergeant?" "Professor's instincts have been solid since she arrived, sir.
She's caught things that our other linguists missed, and she understands the cultural context better than most.
If she says something's not right, I'm inclined to listen.
The colonel was quiet for a long moment, weighing his options. The Marja meeting was important for maintaining relationships with local officials, and postponing it could have political ramifications.
But if Sarah's analysis was correct, sending the convoy into a coordinated ambush would be far worse than missing a single meeting. Morrison had not survived multiple deployments by ignoring potential threats, no matter how uncertain they might seem. "Barnes, get me the current intelligence picture for the Marja corridor," Morrison ordered. "I want every piece of information we have about Taliban activity along that route over the past month."
Rodriguez, contact our Afghan partners and see if they've noticed anything unusual in their areas. Professor, I want you to continue monitoring communications and see if you can identify any additional patterns. As the team dispersed to gather additional information, Sarah found herself both exhilarated and terrified by the responsibility that had suddenly been placed on her shoulders. Her academic background had prepared her to analyze language patterns, but she had never been in a situation where her analysis could directly impact the safety of American forces.
The weight of potentially preventing an ambush was balanced against the possibility that she was wrong and would be responsible for disrupting an important mission. Over the next hour, the intelligence picture began to coalesce in ways that supported Sarah's initial assessment.
Afghan partners reported unusual Taliban movement in areas adjacent to the planned convoy route. Drone surveillance had identified several locations where improvised explosive devices might have been emplaced. This, most significantly, communications intercepts from Taliban units continued to use the coded terminology that Sarah had identified, with increasing references to the timing and logistics of an unspecified operation. Colonel Morrison called for a final assessment meeting at 11 hours, bringing together the intelligence team, convoy commanders, and senior staff.
The conference room was crowded with officers and senior enlisted personnel, most of whom Sarah recognized but had never worked with directly. She found herself the only civilian in a room full of career military professionals, explaining linguistic patterns that could determine whether Americans lived or died.
Based on our analysis, Sarah began, her voice steady despite her nervousness, Taliban forces in our area have developed and implemented a coordinated communication security protocol. This indicates operational planning at a level we haven't seen from local units in several months.
Combined with increased activity along the Marja corridor and the timing of recent communications, I assess that there is a high probability of a coordinated ambush targeting today's convoy mission. The room was silent as officers processed this information.
Captain Williams, who was scheduled to command the convoy, asked the question everyone was thinking. "What's your confidence level, and what do you recommend?" Sarah looked around the room at faces that represented years of military experience and tactical expertise. These men and women had fought in battles she could barely imagine, and they were asking for her professional judgment on a matter that could affect all their lives. The moment crystallized her transformation from academic observer to active participant in the conflict.
"I recommend postponing the mission until we can gather additional intelligence and potentially adjust the route," she said.
"The linguistic evidence is strong enough to warrant caution, and the potential consequences of being wrong are too severe to ignore." Colonel Morrison nodded slowly, his decision clearly forming as he processed the input from his team. "Captain Williams, mission is postponed pending further intelligence development. Professor Chen, I want you to continue monitoring communications and see if you can learn more about their timeline and objectives. If they're planning an ambush, we might be able to turn this to our advantage." As the meeting dispersed, Sarah realized that her role at Forward Operating Base Phoenix had fundamentally changed. She was no longer just translating intercepts and providing cultural context. She had become an active participant in the tactical decision-making process, and that participation would soon lead her far beyond the safety of the communications bunker into dangers she had never imagined facing. For the remainder of September 15th, Sarah found herself at the center of an intensifying intelligence operation. The communications bunker had become a hive of activity as multiple agencies worked to understand the scope and timing of the suspected Taliban operation. Sarah's linguistic analysis had opened a door into enemy planning that intelligence officers were now rushing to exploit before the window closed. The breakthrough came at 14:30 hours, exactly when the original Marja convoy would have been departing. Sarah was monitoring live communications intercepts when she heard a Taliban commander use the coded terminology to confirm that the harvest time approaches. Even more significantly, he referenced specific geographic markers that Sarah recognized from her study of the planned convoy route. The ambush wasn't just theoretical anymore. It was imminent and targeted.
"Rodriguez, you need to hear this," Sarah called out, motioning for the master sergeant to join her at the monitoring station. She played back the intercept, providing real-time translation as the Taliban voices discussed timing and positioning.
They're definitely planning to hit a convoy on the Marja route, and based on the timing references, they're expecting it today or tomorrow. Rodriguez immediately contacted Colonel Morrison, who arrived at the bunker within minutes, accompanied by Captain Williams and Major Hayes from the intelligence section. The room quickly filled with personnel as word spread that they had achieved real-time insight into enemy operational planning, a rare and valuable intelligence opportunity. "Can you determine their exact positions from the communications?" Major Hayes asked, studying the topographical map that Captain Williams had spread across the central table. Sarah listened to several additional intercepts, building a mental picture of the Taliban force disposition based on communication patterns and geographic references. They have at least 3 distinct units positioned along a 2-kilometer stretch of Highway 1, approximately 15 kilometers south of here. Based on the communication structure, I estimate they're planning a complex ambush with multiple phases, probably including improvised explosive devices followed by small arms fire from concealed positions. Colonel Morrison studied the map, his tactical experience allowing him to visualize how the ambush would unfold. The location the Taliban had chosen was tactically sound, offering multiple escape routes while forcing any convoy into a narrow kill zone with limited opportunities for maneuver. If the original mission had proceeded as planned, the results would have been catastrophic. "This is exactly the kind of intelligence we need to turn the tables," Morrison said, his mind clearly working through operational possibilities. "If we know where they are and when they expect to hit our convoy, we can plan a counter-ambush that eliminates a significant Taliban force." The concept that emerged from the planning session was elegant in its simplicity. A decoy convoy would proceed along the original Marjar route at the expected time, but instead of containing the actual diplomatic mission, it would be a combat patrol prepared for contact. Meanwhile, dismounted infantry units would move into position during the hours of darkness to attack the Taliban ambush sites from multiple directions, catching the enemy in their own trap. Sarah found herself unexpectedly central to the planning process. Her linguistic analysis had not only identified the threat but provided ongoing intelligence about Taliban intentions and timeline. Colonel Morrison requested that she continue monitoring communications throughout the operation, providing real-time updates on any changes to enemy plans or positioning. "I'll need you to maintain communication intercept throughout the night and during tomorrow's operation," Morrison told Sarah during the final planning meeting. "Your language skills are the only way we can track their movements and ensure our timing is correct." The assignment presented Sarah with an unexpected dilemma. Standard protocol called for civilian contractors to remain in hardened shelters during active combat operations, but effective communication monitoring required being mobile and responsive to changing tactical situations. The compromise that emerged from discussions with Morrison and the intelligence team was that Sarah would accompany the operation in an up-armored command vehicle, providing her with both mobility and protection while keeping her close enough to provide real-time linguistic support. The decision to participate directly in a combat operation was not one Sarah made lightly. Her contract with Global Language Solutions had anticipated translation work in a secure environment, not direct participation in tactical operations. But the intelligence she had developed was too valuable to exploit remotely, and her unique understanding of the Taliban communication patterns made her irreplaceable for the mission's success. That evening, as Sarah prepared her equipment and reviewed the operation plan, Dr. Lisa Park found her in their shared quarters, methodically checking her body armor and communications gear. "You know this is crazy, right?" Lisa said, sitting on her bunk and watching her roommate prepare for something that neither of them had imagined when they arrived in Afghanistan. "Probably," Sarah admitted, testing the radio frequencies she would need to monitor during the operation. "But if I stay here and something goes wrong because they miss a crucial communication, I'll never forgive myself. At least this way I can provide immediate updates if their plans change." Lisa helped Sarah adjust her body armor, ensuring that the ceramic plates were properly positioned and that her radio equipment was accessible but protected. They had both received basic combat training during their pre-deployment preparation, but neither had expected to use those skills in actual operations. The weight of the armor and equipment felt different now that Sarah knew she would be wearing it in a real combat environment rather than during training exercises. The final intelligence briefing took place at 0200 hours on September 16th. In the base's Tactical Operations Center. Sarah found herself surrounded by soldiers and Marines who would be executing the operation, professional warriors who had volunteered to place themselves in danger. Based largely on her linguistic analysis, the responsibility was both humbling and terrifying. Captain Williams reviewed the operational timeline and coordination procedures, emphasizing the importance of maintaining communication discipline and following the planned phases of the operation. Sarah would be positioned in the command vehicle with the radio operators and intelligence personnel, providing real-time translation of any Taliban communications that might indicate changes to their plans or positions. Remember, this entire operation depends on maintaining surprise. Williams briefed the assembled personnel.
The Taliban think they're ambushing a routine convoy. If they realize we're coming for them, they'll scatter and we'll lose the opportunity to eliminate a significant threat.
Everyone needs to maintain noise and light discipline until we initiate contact. As the briefing concluded and personnel moved to their final preparation, Sarah realized that she had crossed a threshold from which there was no return.
She was no longer a civilian contractor providing linguistic support from the safety of a bunker. She had become an active participant in a combat operation, placing herself in harm's way to ensure that her intelligence analysis could be fully exploited.
The command vehicle she would occupy during the operation was an up-armored Humvee equipped with sophisticated communication equipment and reinforced with additional armor plating.
Sarah spent an hour before departure familiarizing herself with the radio systems and emergency procedures, ensuring that she could maintain communication intercept even while the vehicle was moving across rough terrain. Master Sergeant Rodriguez would be accompanying the operation as the senior intelligence representative, and his presence provided Sarah with both professional support and personal reassurance.
They had worked together closely over the past 3 months, and Rodriguez had developed confidence in Sarah's analytical abilities that extended beyond her linguistic skills to her overall tactical judgment. "You sure about this, Professor?" Rodriguez asked as they conducted final equipment checks in the pre-dawn darkness.
"Nobody would think less of you for staying back at the base. This isn't what you signed up for."
Sarah considered the question seriously, knowing that Rodriguez was offering her a final opportunity to reconsider her decision. The Taliban ambush site they were approaching contained an unknown number of enemy fighters who would be fighting for their lives once they realized they had been discovered. The command vehicle would be positioned close enough to provide effective communication intercept, which meant close enough to be targeted by enemy fire. "I'm sure," Sarah replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "This intelligence opportunity exists because of pattern recognition I developed over months of work. If I'm not there to interpret changes in their communication patterns, we could miss something crucial.
Besides, if this operation succeeds, it could prevent them from conducting ambushes against other convoys in the future." As dawn approached and the operation moved into its final preparation phase, Sarah found herself mentally crossing a line she had never expected to approach.
She was about to accompany American forces into combat against Taliban fighters who had been planning to kill American soldiers. Her linguistic skills, originally intended for academic research and teaching, were about to be employed in a life-and-death struggle in the mountains of Afghanistan.
The irony of her situation was not lost on Sarah, as she climbed into the command vehicle and began her final communication checks. She had spent years studying how language evolved under pressure, how communities adapted their communication patterns to survive in hostile environments. Now she was about to witness that process in real time, while simultaneously using her understanding of those patterns to help eliminate the people who had created them. At 0430 hours, the operation began its movement toward the Taliban ambush site, with Sarah monitoring enemy communications from the passenger seat of an armored vehicle that was heading directly toward a fight she had helped to identify and plan. Her transformation from academic linguist to combat intelligence operator was complete, though she wouldn't fully understand the implications until the first shots were fired. The convoy moved through the pre-dawn darkness with the practiced silence of experienced combat troops. Sarah sat in the passenger seat of the command vehicle, surrounded by radio equipment and monitoring devices that allowed her to intercept Taliban communications in real time. The weight of her body armor and the unfamiliar sensation of the loaded M4 rifle secured beside her served as constant reminders that she was no longer in the protected environment of the communications bunker. The landscape outside the armored windows was desolate and hostile, illuminated only by the faint green glow of night vision devices. Sarah had studied maps of this region extensively during her months on the base, but seeing it through the thick glass of an armored vehicle while heading toward an armed confrontation gave the terrain an entirely different character. Every shadowed ridge and rocky outcropping could conceal enemy fighters. Every cluster of buildings could hide an ambush. Master Sergeant Rodriguez sat beside her, monitoring multiple radio frequencies while maintaining communication with the infantry units that were moving into position around the Taliban ambush site. The coordination required to execute the counter-ambush was complex, involving precise timing and positioning of forces across several kilometers of difficult terrain. Sarah's role was to provide real-time updates on enemy communications that might indicate changes to Taliban plans or positioning. At 0515 hours, Sarah detected the first significant Taliban communication since the operation began. A Taliban commander was conducting a radio check with his subordinate units, confirming their positions and readiness for the planned ambush. More importantly, he referenced the timing for their attack, indicating that they expected the American convoy to enter their kill zone at approximately 0730 hours. "They're still on their original timeline," Sarah reported to Rodriguez, who immediately relayed the information to Captain Williams and the other unit commanders. No indication they suspect anything unusual.
They're expecting us to follow the standard convoy route and timing. The intelligence allowed Williams to fine-tune the timing of the counter-ambush, ensuring that American forces would be in optimal positions before the Taliban realized their plans had been compromised.
The decoy convoy would enter the ambush site exactly when the Taliban expected, but instead of being a vulnerable target, it would serve as the trigger for a coordinated attack that would catch the enemy completely by surprise. As the operation progressed, Sarah found herself developing an intimate understanding of the Taliban force they were approaching. Through their communications, she learned that they had been planning this ambush for over a week, positioning fighters and weapons during hours of darkness to avoid detection by American surveillance. The unit included approximately 25 fighters organized into 3 distinct groups, each responsible for a different phase of the planned attack.
The Taliban commander was a veteran fighter known by the call sign Falcon, someone whose voice Sarah had heard in previous intercepts over the past month. His tactical communications revealed significant military experience and careful attention to operational security.
Under different circumstances, Sarah might have found his professional competence admirable. Today, it made him a more dangerous adversary.
At 0600 hours, the American forces were in position around the Taliban ambush site, with infantry units occupying concealed positions on the ridgelines overlooking the highway. The decoy convoy was approaching from the north, maintaining standard tactical formations and communication procedures that would not alert the Taliban to the trap being prepared for them.
Sarah continued monitoring enemy communications, listening for any indication that their presence had been detected. "Falcon is conducting final coordination with his units," Sarah reported, translating the Taliban commander's instructions to his subordinates. "He's reminding them to wait for his signal before initiating contact. They're disciplined and well-coordinated.
This isn't going to be easy once it starts."
The tension in the command vehicle was palpable as the operation approached its climactic moment. Everyone understood that the next few minutes would determine whether months of intelligence work would result in a significant tactical victory or a deadly confrontation with uncertain outcomes.
Sarah's linguistic analysis had created this opportunity, but success would depend on the skill and courage of the soldiers and Marines who would execute the counter-ambush. At 0728 hours, exactly 2 minutes before the Taliban expected to initiate their ambush, Captain Williams gave the order to commence the attack.
American forces opened fire simultaneously from multiple directions, catching the Taliban fighters completely unprepared for the coordinated assault. The sound of gunfire erupted across the mountainous terrain, echoing off rock faces and creating a cacophony that made radio communication difficult.
Sarah found herself in the surreal position of monitoring enemy communications during an active firefight. Through her headphones, she could hear Taliban fighters calling for assistance, reporting casualties, and attempting to coordinate their response to the unexpected attack. Their disciplined communication structure began to break down as the reality of their situation became clear. Multiple Taliban units requesting immediate reinforcement, Sarah reported, raising her voice over the sound of gunfire. "Falcon is trying to organize a fighting withdrawal to the southeast, but his units are taking heavy casualties. One group is completely cut off from the main force." The battle developed exactly as Captain Williams had planned. The Taliban fighters, positioned for an ambush they never had the chance to execute, found themselves trapped in a kill zone, with American forces attacking from the high ground. The tactical advantage they had expected to exploit was turned completely against them, creating a devastating reversal of fortune that exemplified the value of superior intelligence and careful planning. However, the Taliban response was more organized and determined than anyone had anticipated. Despite being caught completely by surprise, Falcon managed to rally his surviving fighters and organize a coordinated counterattack against what he correctly identified as the weakest point in the American positions. Sarah listened in real time as he directed his fighters to concentrate their remaining forces against the southern flank, where the terrain favored a determined assault. "They're massing for a counterattack against Charlie Company's position," Sarah reported urgently. "Falcon has identified a weakness in our southern perimeter, and he's sending everything he has left in that direction. Estimate 15-20 fighters moving to grid reference." She quickly converted the geographic markers the Taliban were using into coordinates that Captain Williams could understand. The warning allowed Williams to reinforce the threatened position just as the Taliban counterattack began. What could have been a successful penetration of American lines instead became another killing ground, where Taliban fighters found themselves exposed to concentrated fire from prepared positions. The combination of Sarah's real-time intelligence and Williams's tactical flexibility was proving devastatingly effective. But the Taliban had one final surprise prepared. As their main counterattack faltered under heavy American fire,
Falcon activated a reserve unit that had been positioned several kilometers away, specifically to respond to unexpected developments. This unit began moving toward the battle, intending to attack the American command element and support vehicles that were positioned in what should have been a secure rear area. Sarah detected the communications from this new threat just as the first rocket-propelled grenade impacted near the command vehicle. The explosion rocked the armored Humvee and shattered the passenger side window, showering Sarah with broken glass and instantly transforming her from an intelligence observer into a direct participant in the fighting. Contact rear. Contact rear, Rodriguez shouted into his radio, grabbing his rifle and preparing to exit the vehicle. Unknown number of enemy fighters attacking the command post from the east. Sarah's academic training had not prepared her for the sensory overload of being under direct fire. The sound of bullets impacting the armored vehicle was unlike anything she had experienced. A metallic ringing that seemed to penetrate directly into her nervous system.
The smell of explosives and burning equipment filled the vehicle, mixing with the taste of fear and adrenaline that seemed to coat her mouth.
"We need to move," Rodriguez shouted, indicating that staying in the immobilized command vehicle would make them easy targets for the approaching Taliban fighters.
Grab your rifle and follow me to that rocky outcropping. We need cover and we need it now. Sarah's training took over despite her terror. She grabbed her M4 rifle, checked that a round was chambered, and followed Rodriguez out of the damaged vehicle. The transition from the relative safety of the armored compartment to the open terrain under fire was the most terrifying moment of her life.
Bullets whined overhead as they sprinted toward the rocky position that Rodriguez had identified as their best available cover.
She was no longer a civilian contractor providing linguistic support.
She was a combatant in direct contact with enemy forces, armed and responsible for her own survival, and the survival of the personnel around her. The Taliban fighters approaching their position would not distinguish between her and the soldiers she was supporting. "Can you still monitor their communications?" Rodriguez asked as they established defensive positions among the rocks. "We need to know how many are coming and what their plan is." Sarah activated her portable radio equipment, her hands shaking slightly as she tuned to the Taliban frequencies she had been monitoring throughout the operation.
Despite the fear and adrenaline coursing through her system, her linguistic skills remained intact. She could still understand the enemy communications that would determine whether they survived the next few minutes. 8 fighters moving toward our position, she reported, translating the Taliban coordination in real time. They know we're the command element and they're trying to capture or kill the leadership. They have at least 2 RPGs and they're planning to attack from multiple directions. The final phase of Sarah's transformation was about to begin. She was no longer just translating enemy communications or providing intelligence analysis. She was about to fight for her life with a rifle in her hands, defending herself and her comrades against Taliban fighters who were determined to kill them all. The rocky outcropping that Sarah and Rodriguez had reached provided minimal cover from the Taliban fighters approaching their position. Sarah pressed herself against the largest boulder, her M4 rifle held in a firing position she had practiced dozens of times on the base's firing range but never imagined using in combat. The academic who had arrived in Afghanistan 3 months earlier to study language patterns was gone, replaced by someone she barely recognized but who seemed to know exactly what needed to be done. Through her portable radio equipment, Sarah continued monitoring Taliban communications even as bullets impacted the rocks around their position. The enemy fighters were coordinating their attack with professional precision, moving to surround the American command position while maintaining radio discipline that would have impressed their instructors at Fort Benning. Sarah found herself simultaneously admiring their tactical competence and planning how to use their own communications against them. "They're splitting into 2 teams, Sarah reported to Rodriguez, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. 4 fighters moving to our north, 4 to the south. They plan to attack simultaneously in approximately 2 minutes. The northern team has both RPGs. Rodriguez immediately radioed this intelligence to Captain Williams, who was coordinating the overall battle from his position with Charlie Company. The main engagement against the Taliban ambush force was concluding successfully, but the unexpected attack on the command element threatened to turn tactical victory into strategic disaster. Williams needed to disengage forces from the primary battle to respond to the new threat. A complex maneuver under the best circumstances and potentially catastrophic under fire. "Williams is moving a squad from Charlie Company to assist us," Rodriguez informed Sarah. "But they won't reach our position for at least 10 minutes. We need to hold this position until reinforcements arrive." Sarah checked her rifle again, ensuring that her safety was off and that she had a full magazine. The weight of the weapon felt different now that she knew she would have to use it to stay alive. Her months of training on the firing range had prepared her for the mechanical aspects of marksmanship, but nothing could have prepared her for the psychological reality of aiming at another human being with lethal intent. The first Taliban fighter appeared among the rocks to their north,
moving with the practiced stealth of someone experienced in mountain warfare.
Sarah saw him before Rodriguez did, a realization that crystallized the degree to which her senses had become attuned to survival. Without conscious thought, she acquired the target in her rifle scope and squeezed the trigger, watching the fighter stumble and fall as her bullet found its mark.
The kill shot surprised Sarah more than anyone else. She had fired thousands of rounds in training, but she had never fully believed that she could actually take a human life when the moment demanded it.
The academic portion of her mind noted with detached interest that the psychological barriers she had assumed would prevent her from killing had simply evaporated when survival was at stake. She was discovering capabilities within herself that contradicted everything she thought she knew about her own character.
"Good shot, Professor," Rodriguez said grimly, engaging another Taliban fighter who had appeared among the rocks to their south. 3 more moving in from the north. I count 2 from the south, including one with an RPG. This is about to get interesting. Sarah shifted her position to cover the northern approach, while Rodriguez concentrated on the southern threat. The tactical situation required them to defend in multiple directions simultaneously, a challenging proposition for 2 personnel against 8 attackers. However, their position among the rocks provided natural defensive advantages that trained fighters could exploit. And both Sarah and Rodriguez understood how to maximize those advantages. The second Taliban fighter Sarah engaged was carrying an RPG launcher, a weapon that could eliminate their rocky shelter with a single well-placed round. Sarah tracked him through her rifle scope as he moved between boulders, searching for an angle of attack that would allow him to employ his weapon effectively. When he paused to acquire his target, Sarah fired 2 quick shots that dropped him before he could launch his rocket. The psychological impact of her second kill was different from the first. Sarah felt no hesitation, no moral conflict, no academic analysis of what she was doing. She had become a predator protecting her territory and her pack, operating on instincts she had never known she possessed.
The Taliban fighters trying to kill her had become simply problems to be solved with precise application of marksmanship skills. "Rodriguez, we have a problem," Sarah called out, monitoring Taliban communications while engaging targets. "They've called for additional reinforcements. A larger unit is moving in our direction from the village. We could be facing 30 or 40 fighters within the next hour." This intelligence changed everything. Even with reinforcement from Charlie Company, a squad-sized American element could not successfully defend against a reinforced Taliban assault. Captain Williams would need to disengage from the primary battle immediately and concentrate his forces to deal with the expanding threat, potentially allowing some of the original ambush force to escape. Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her life. "Rodriguez, I'm going to try something. Keep them off me for 60 seconds. Before Rodriguez could ask what she planned, Sarah activated her radio on the Taliban command frequency and began speaking in fluent Dari, imitating the voice patterns and communication style she had studied for months. "Falcon, this is Mountain Eagle. American reinforcements approaching from the west in company strength. Recommend immediate withdrawal to secondary positions before we are trapped." The effect was instantaneous. Sarah listened as Falcon immediately ordered his fighters to disengage and withdraw toward predetermined escape routes. The Taliban commander's tactical discipline, which had made him such a dangerous adversary, now worked in favor of the Americans as he responded to what he believed was intelligence from one of his own units. "Holy shit, Professor," Rodriguez said, staring at Sarah with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. "Did you just impersonate a Taliban commander to break up their attack?" "Academic linguistics has some practical applications," Sarah replied, maintaining her watch for any fighters who might not have received Falcon's withdrawal order. "I've been studying their communication patterns for months. I know how they talk, how they think, how they organize their operations. Sometimes the best weapon is the one they can't see coming." The Taliban withdrawal was rapid and well-coordinated, testimony to Falcon's leadership and his unit's discipline. Within minutes, the immediate threat to the command position had evaporated as enemy fighters melted away into the mountainous terrain they knew better than any American force. The larger battle was concluding with overwhelming American tactical victory, but Sarah's linguistic deception had prevented what could have been a costly secondary engagement. Captain Williams arrived at the command position 30 minutes later with reinforcements from Charlie Company, finding Sarah and Rodriguez maintaining defensive positions among rocks that were scarred by bullet impacts and rocket explosions. Williams had difficulty processing what he was seeing, a civilian contractor who had somehow transitioned from intelligence analyst to frontline combatant to psychological warfare specialist in the span of a single morning. "Rodriguez tells me you saved the operation," Williams said to Sarah as medics checked both of them for injuries. "Not just with the initial intelligence that let us set up the counter-ambush, but with some kind of radio deception that broke up their counterattack." Sarah was struggling to process her own transformation as much as Williams was.
The person who had started the day as a civilian translator was gone, replaced by someone who had killed enemy fighters and deceived their leadership using skills she had developed for entirely different purposes. She felt no regret about what she had done, but she was beginning to understand that she could never return to the person she had been before.
I did what needed to be done. Sarah replied simply. The linguistic analysis identified the threat, the tactical situation required direct engagement, and the strategic situation called for psychological warfare.
I used the tools I had available. The broader battle had concluded with complete American tactical success.
The Taliban ambush force had been eliminated, or scattered, with significant casualties and loss of equipment. More importantly, the counter-ambush had disrupted Taliban operations in the region for months, as remaining fighters became reluctant to concentrate forces for large-scale operations.
Sarah's initial pattern recognition had not only prevented an American catastrophe, but had created an intelligence and tactical victory that would resonate throughout Helmand Province. As the American forces consolidated their positions and prepared for withdrawal to Forward Operating Base Phoenix, Sarah found herself fundamentally changed in ways she was still discovering.
She had killed enemy fighters without hesitation when survival demanded it. She had used her linguistic skills as weapons of psychological warfare. Most importantly, she had discovered that she possessed capabilities and instincts that contradicted everything she thought she knew about herself. Master Sergeant Rodriguez approached Sarah as she packed her equipment for the return journey.
So what happens now, Professor? You've just proven that you're more than a translator.
You're a complete intelligence operator with combat experience. That's not something you walk away from easily.
Sarah considered Rodriguez's question seriously. Her contract with Global Language Solutions had been for linguistic support, not combat operations. She could return to the safety of the communications bunker and resume her original mission of translating intercepts and providing cultural analysis, but she knew that she could never be satisfied with purely academic work after discovering what she was capable of when lives were at stake.
I think I need to reconsider my career options, Sarah said, looking across the battlefield where her transformation had been completed. Apparently, I'm not just good at understanding language patterns. I'm good at using them as weapons. That's not something they teach in graduate school.
The convoy returning to Forward Operating Base Phoenix carried a different Sarah Chen than the one who had departed that morning. The academic linguist who had arrived in Afghanistan 3 months earlier to study communication patterns had become something entirely new. A warrior scholar who understood that sometimes the most powerful weapons are the ones that exist entirely in the realm of ideas and words.
Her journey from the safety of the communications bunker into the line of fire had revealed capabilities she never knew she possessed and changed the trajectory of her life forever.
In the months that followed, Sarah would decline to renew her contract with Global Language Solutions. Instead, she would accept a position with a classified government agency that specialized in the intersection of linguistics and intelligence operations.
The translator who had been thrust into the line of fire had discovered that she belonged there, fighting a different kind of war, with weapons that most people never realized existed. Her story would become legend among intelligence professionals, proof that sometimes the most unlikely people possess the most extraordinary capabilities when circumstances demand them.
Just a translator at base, until a convoy attack thrust her into the line of fire.